Okay, I'm sure many of you know Dwight Merriam. He's one of the leading land use lawyers in the country with the firm of Robinson and Cole in Connecticut, and is also a degreed planner, certified planner, as well as one of the best lawyers I know. And after Dwight, we have Sarah Braun, who is not a boomer, as you can see, one of the rising stars in legal education, and I think you'll find her presentation very interesting and enjoyable.
Well, Sarah Bronin's a rising star. I'm a falling star at my point, but
Hartford is New England's.
well, Hartford's New England's rising star.
I'm dark star.
Dark star. I'm in private practice, but I've taught every year for the last 33 years since I graduated from law school. So I sort of have a mixed view of some of these issues, and I want to thank, in particular, directly Fred for inviting me to participate in this, and to Dave Callies, who, when Dave asked me to do something, I'm there to do it. And I'm pleased to be here, and I'm honored to be part of this group to comment on what's happened here historically. Now, where do we get, are we going to be able to, where's the slideshow? Here we go. I also want to thank Dean Corky for his remarks this morning, and Celeste Hammond and Heather Harper and John Estrada for all their support. It's a lot of work to put together a meeting like this, a lot of work. And I appreciate all that they've done. You know, it's hard being one of the last couple of speakers of the day, and Chris beat me to it. You know, I believe in trivia and door prizes. And here's the door prize. My partner said this book was so bad I couldn't give it away. I'm going to prove him wrong today. And the first prize is, what? The first prize is 2 books, and the second prize is 1 book. You know that joke. But here it is. Now this is trivia. You don't have to know all this pop culture stuff that Dirksen knows, but just tell me, write it down on a piece of paper, and incidentally, you get ethics credit for this, if you do it right. What is the area in square miles of Lake Michigan? Write the number down, just take a guess, who's ever closest gets a book. And the other one is the Field Museum has the Chalmers topaz. Anybody seen it there at the Field Museum? Well, this is really funny, isn't it? It's the largest topaz ever, I think. And I'm surprised that some of you haven't seen it. Chalmers topaz, how many carats is it? All right, now first, what's the square miles of Lake Michigan?
We're going to have the answer on our...
Anybody? Yeah, I could see that. He was looking it up. Anybody want to take a guess?
20,000.
22,300. Anybody closer than 20,000? You get a book. Congratulations.
He got it. He got it. We gave your book away at a APA.
My partners say I couldn't give it away. Put it on eBay.
All right, anybody want to guess how many carats this topaz is? It's enormous. I just couldn't believe it when I looked it up. Anybody pick a number, any number. The answer is, anybody write a number down, any kind of
I want a
number.
book, 315.
315 is very close, except it's 5,890. But that may be good enough to get the book. Anybody closer, 5,890 carats? Get the book.
This is a used book.
Here, you seem to have lost your book. All right, let's shuffle on here. This is really about legacies. There are 3 legacies today, and we haven't talked about a couple of them. One of them is Bob Kratovil, and one of the advantages and benefits of agreeing to do something like this is you get to learn about areas and the subject matter and the people involved. And I didn't know him, I'd never met him, I didn't know anything about him until I was invited and did some research. And I imagine many of you in the room knew him. Raise your hands, those who knew Bob Kratovil. Did you know he was a poet? He published poems in the ABA Journal. Now we need a poet real estate in this economy. Oh, don't trust the creditor. He seldom is a predator, and so forth. But anybody has the the impetus to write a poem about real estate, this would be a really good time. But it's also about Ross and Hardies. I graduated, I had a little 7-year hiatus during Vietnam doing something else, and graduated from law school in 1978, and Ross and Hardies was for sure. And so this is partly a celebration, another of 2 out of the 3 legacies. This is a list I didn't remember before that Steve Elrod had been there, and I probably missed some others, but look at the leaders in this profession. And of that list, R. Marlon Smith was my mentor. And when I was 40 and he died at 55, I was overcome. And I couldn't understand why. He was in Chicago, I was in Hartford. It was before email and all those ways of staying connected. But he, like Dan, I knew Dan Mendelker was my mentor because he was always there helping me along as I started my career. And I just didn't realize when Marlon and I did these planning law road shows we did around the country, several a year, that he had become my mentor without knowing it. So those of you who are old enough to be mentors, do your job. Those who are young enough to have mentors, seek them out. And in fact, sometimes you may realize, as I did, that someone was your mentor and you didn't even know it until they were gone. And we all loved Marlon a great deal. So that's another great legacy. And then the Quiet Revolution. Why I hadn't read this book in 40 years. I read it when it came out. If you haven't read it, it's free online, as has been said. And so I looked through it for a few key points to try to find out where it may not have accurately forecasted what was going to happen or why things changed. Like Chris's remarks, very interesting in the context of the Quiet Revolution, and coming here to speak today caused me to go back and read it again. And you know, there's 80% of it is still good, valid, solid information about programs, most of which remain today. But here are a couple of key points. And these are cut and pasted right out of the book. It begins by saying that the Quiet Revolution is the overthrow of the feudal system. The system under which the entire pattern of land development has been controlled by thousands of individual governments. That part of the Quiet Revolution, part of the driving force, this is a guy named Mongo who's from Nashville in Florida and who likes to decorate his lawn with outrageous hangings on clotheslines, sort of like Chris did when he was a young chap, as he related. But that one of the things that cities were trying to do was to stop the depreciation of neighboring properties. They've called themselves city planners. They do mention, Fred and David do mention planned unit developments, but this comes as close as they do anywhere in the volume to addressing the issue I'm going to tell you about today. But they do recognize the emergence of planned unit developments 40 years ago. They say the problem is one of local control. The real problem, they say, is the structure of zoning itself on very local control. You've heard that spoken here before today. And finally, that local zoning is inadequate. It's the realization of its failures to address some of these issues, the depreciation of properties and the like, that has resulted in part as a driver in the Quiet Revolution. I had this bright idea when first tasked with this that public-private partnerships were something I ought to look at. And I went on Dirt List, many of you know Dirt List, I went on the listserv for the fellows of AICP, and I said to people, don't you think that the zoning system has really changed dramatically when it's a public-private partnership because the government now has a stake, has some skin in the game? I couldn't find a single article on it, I couldn't find a book, and I got like 12 anecdotes from people. Oh yeah, it probably does. So I said, this is not going to work. I can't fill 22 minutes with this. So I abandoned the idea, but I do think it's something we need to study and take a look at. What happens to the decision-making process with the emergence of these many public and private partnerships? Instead, I went back and looked at something that I worked on as a first-year law student all the way up through Sunday. I was working on it for a group, actually, as I prepared to come out here. Private residential developments. Evan McKenzie, who teaches here, has written extensively on this. I went and, as you see, I read his books. I read other books in preparation for today. And the question was, are these private developments, these homeowners associations, these deeds and covenants, some of them going way back hundreds of years, some of them very small, few lots, some of them thousands and thousands of lots, do they take away from the quiet revolution? Can they support it, or are they a little bit of both? So these are the books I read. I hadn't read any of these. Privatopia, if you haven't read it, excellent book. This book by Glass, it's a world perspective. Fortress America by Ed Blakely, which I hadn't read either, but I wanted to go back and learn more about gated communities. And this most recent version of the '94 book, but completely updated with a little different slant by Evan McKenzie. I highly recommend you start with Beyond Privatopia for your reading if you're interested in the subject. Look at these numbers. In 1971, when the Quiet Revolution was published, there were probably something around 10,000, and they had grown from 500 common interest developments of all types, planned residential developments, planned unit developments, clustered developments, homeowners associations with little pieces of open space left over, systems of covenants and restrictions and single-family detached subdivisions, the whole range of types of communities. And now look today, over 300,000, over a quarter, over 20% now today, 2011, are in these private communities with separate systems of governance, 300 and something thousand separate systems of governance. They range from the very small, as I said, to the very large. Anybody recognize what this is? This happens to be Irvine Ranch in California, 93,000 acres, city of Irvine, Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, and the like. They just opened a new section. I was just reading the September 15th minutes of the planning approval for this new section, 597 units, $375 a square foot, a 1,618 square foot unit sells in the high 500 range. They're larger units, they're completely segregated by size, and there's another neighborhood of 2,800 to 3,100 square foot units in the low $1 million range. 280,000 people in the Irvine Ranch, California. What has driven this enormous expansion of these common interest developments? A limited land supply. As we have developed all the good land, we now need to cluster on smaller parcels. The need for density. The developers like the infrastructure savings that come from shorter roads and tighter, denser development. And once you start attaching or semi-attaching buildings or putting units one over the other, you've got to have some type of real estate regime to own, operate, manage those shared resources, whether it's a common wall or a driveway or whatever. The demographics driving the average household size down. A town in the last 12 or 15 years that had a zero population growth still needs 10% more dwelling units because the average household size has decreased. The predominant household type today is probably single individuals and will be as we go forward. Fiscal impact. For those states like my state, Connecticut, and New Jersey, the two leading states that are dependent on local property tax, 83 or 4% of Connecticut's local budgets come from property taxes, are totally driven by ratables. What do they love? The age 55 and older community. They'll approve that in a heartbeat, but not single-family detached 4-bedroom houses with children because the children will kill their school budget. So the demographics and the fiscal impact together have driven the municipal support for these types of development. Seeking to avoid negative externalities and to off-site impacts like our friend Mongo, and to capture the positive externalities of open space. I say this is a little like that term, average reciprocity of advantage, where we have historic preservation or other restrictive regimes, because yes, there are things that you can't do at your house, but at least you're safe in knowing that your neighbor can't do it to you. And that's what's sought by the owners in these communities. They want to be exclusive, and they want to exclude. They used to exclude on the basis of race, alienage, nationality. Now they exclude largely on the basis of income, wealth, and social class. A desire for a lifestyle and higher levels of service than what the local governments can provide, and security. Again and again and again we see the search for security. And here's some of the states where the quiet revolution talked about efforts to bring to sub-state, regional, and state controls. And so I went and took a look at a few of the states, and incidentally, this PowerPoint's available outside. There's also an article that I'm giving in Prague the end of October on international comparisons of gated, principally gated communities, and there are 10 copies of that, and if you run out and you're interested, let me know, and I'll email it to you. But here's a Hawaii case. Problems again and again and again about what you can do. Here's another venue from the Quiet Revolution, another homeowners association case, a problem we see again and again and again across the country, the developer's rights. What rights does a new developer have to come in and build there? Massachusetts, I had to go back to '93 to get this, but I wanted to tell you this because if you haven't heard about it before, pet amortization. There are things in these private developments that government would never even think of trying. It's a contract, it's not a constitution. And pet amortization is pet and amortization. If you got a pet and you're not supposed to have one, when that pet dies, you're not getting another one. And these people had pets and they got another one, and the courts in Massachusetts said, no, the pet's got to go. And lots of other rules, things like at this particular development here in Massachusetts, even the rules require that you put plastic covers on the bottoms of all items placed on the balcony. You have to have little rubber feet on your chairs. Anyway, and violations, all kinds of rules for violations. Maine, another developer's expansion case, a real problem today. Minnesota, there you can't plant certain trees in your residential neighborhood. They don't like cottonwood or box elder, so don't have one or they'll start enforcement action against you. And gated communities, enormous problem. Ed Blakely's book is an excellent review of it. This happens to be Kiowa, and I represented the Kiowa developers in the transition to the Homeowners Association. One thing that's interesting about Kiowa is, see these two little white lines? It's a double gated community. You can get behind one gate, but then to get behind the second gate requires a completely different level of access to get down to the ocean course. And one of the problems that we have, a real problem, is connectivity. This is a Hilton Head, all cul-de-sacs, mostly gated. A study was just described in Atlantic Magazine last month by two engineers who found that it was generally safer in terms of traffic safety to live in a cul-de-sac community unless you left the cul-de-sac. Then it was more dangerous. And the reason is, to go to your next door neighbor's house, you have to drive all the way out to the main drag. Anybody been to Hilton Head and been caught in traffic there? It's horrible. And get out on the main drag, drive down a divided highway to go to the neighbor that you could throw a baseball at over the fence. And here's typical of a resort down there with gates. And this is their chief of security saying, these days we mostly spend our time enforcing regulations about window blinds, doors, and balconies, and not behavior problems. So, what's the problem in terms of the Quiet Revolution? Unit owners are largely powerless here. These are volunteers for the most part. They really don't have the capability to manage these complex developments. In many cases, critical resources, we find many enforcement cases. People turn their backs on the larger local governments. They don't participate in local government anymore. Very hard to adjust these. Chris mentioned the right to dry. I've done some writing on the right to dry issue. I have a right to dry restriction on my own house. We just put up a clothesline and told the whole world we were drying our clothes outside regardless. Come get me. And but how do you change them? You got to have 2/3 of the unit owners all agree. It's very hard to change these, and if we're going to get some of the older ones to change, we have to make it easier. The connectivity issue, social equity, the collection practices. There are people that have lost their homes over $100 assessments that weren't paid. Inadequate capital reserves throughout. No oversight really by government, and now we're seeing one after another bankruptcies, 5 of them recently in Florida. The homeowners associations, their units are worth a fraction of what they were originally. They're not collecting their assessments. They don't have the money to run and operate. they're going bankrupt. The association is an entity. But there may be something good from these. They are able to manage resources when they're large enough. The Corps of Engineers has a program here in the Chicago district involving homeowners associations. Here's one from Sarasota, Florida, Meadow Walk, which has decided to change to manage their wetlands and littoral shelf in a better way. So if they're big enough and well enough managed and subsidized, they can do a much better job, as the Quiet Revolution seeks to do, in managing environmental resources. And finally, whenever I have dinner with my planner friends, as Fred said, I are a planner, by the time we reach the dessert course, we're always talking about sewers. I swear that I'm absolutely positive about that. And the reason is because they drive development. Here's a typical development with an on-site septic scattered all over, sprawled all over the landscape. But if we can get good homeowners associations to take control of large areas of land, we can put those systems on the land most suited for it, cluster them tightly, achieve those landforms that the Quiet Revolution seeks. And the same with distributed energy production. Single-family homeowners can't do a lot of this, but large collections of homes in homeowners associations can do this. And there's great experience recently in California. Finally, the agenda for action. This is what I think needs to be done in order to help these homeowners associations be an active part of the Quiet Revolution to promote the ends discussed in that book. We need state legislative reform of all types. We have no oversight. We need to have oversight, and we need to audit what's going on there. Some type of ombudsperson or somebody to represent the unit owners has succeeded in some states. We need to get public support for the local governments out of these associations, create incentives for these groups to do distributed energy development, and make it easy to amend the ordinances. A couple of quick last points. There's nothing in the Quiet Revolution about technology. Technology in terms of social networking, as Patty suggested, and all of the means of communication have profoundly changed. And one of them deals with where people can live. I mean, the Quiet Revolution talked about people living in distant places. Now it's a real phenomenon. And finally, 2 points and an addendum. One is that special area management plans, I think, are the way to go. And finally, we're not going to have a Quiet Revolution without development. Until the development market returns, we won't have that driver. So thank you very much.
Hi, last speaker of the day. I stand between you and your cocktails. Thank you to David, to Fred, to Celeste, to all of our hosts, to fellow speakers from whom I've learned so much today. I have lots of gratitude, but no door prizes, so you'll have to bear with me for my presentation. Okay, the Quiet Revolution and renewables. The vast majority of Americans support renewable energy, at least in concept. Yet when it comes down to choosing exactly where renewable energy generating facilities must be sited, opposition sometimes surfaces. So what is the nature of this opposition? So neighbors might say that there are negative impacts in the form of noise or visual pollution. They might also object to restrictions placed on their activities when a renewable energy project is sited nearby. Environmentalists, meanwhile, may question the environmental impact of certain types of projects. Growing biofuels uses too much land. Large wind turbines kill birds, and so on. Cultural activists and historic preservationists, too, may believe that particular renewable energy projects threaten protected resources. Whatever their motivation, opponents have often been able to take advantage of ambiguities in siting rules to stall or stop renewable projects. At the same time, many investors and private property owners have declined to invest in projects where legal authority for siting was not clear. So for everyone's sake, I think that we should develop clearer rules about siting renewable energy infrastructure. Parties building or affected by renewable projects have to understand their rights and obligations, or the industry will stagnate while litigation legal disputes rise. So how is the U.S. doing in terms of renewable energy? Right now, globally, 16% of energy consumed comes from renewable resources. And as you can see from the chart that I provided in my materials, only 8% of energy consumed in the U.S. Meets that criteria. So you can see the U.S. still has some growing to do. So my paper will deal with these interjurisdictional issues and how we can clarify the siting rules to help facilitate more renewable energy so we can catch up to the rest of the world. So what is the state of the law now? Right now, the law is unsettled with federal, state, and local jurisdictions each claiming concurrent control. Currently, the federal government has intervened in large-scale projects, so we're talking the big solar fields out in the deserts of Arizona, in the wind farms in Texas to a certain degree. Federal government has intervened in offshore projects. Some of you may have been following the Cape Wind controversy, citing the huge 400-foot tall wind turbines in Nantucket Sound just off the Kennedy compound. So there's a lot on that recently. Federal government has also intervened in projects on federal and tribal lands, and it plays a role in siting certain transmission lines. Some local governments, and by some I mean a handful, maybe 100 out of the 40,000 general purpose local governments nationwide, have explicitly asserted siting control over renewable energy resources through zoning and other land use regulations. And they've typically asserted control over individual small-scale projects, so solar panels on somebody's roof or a geothermal project in somebody's front yard. State governments currently fill in the gaps, so they may have public utility commissions that deal with siting. They may actually have statewide siting councils like Connecticut does. They may have regulations, permitting systems, or other forms of controls over siting. Few public entities have taken positions on mid-sized facilities. And what do I mean by mid-sized facilities? So one of the things I've written about recently is a concept called microgrids. Has anybody heard of this concept? Okay, so a couple people have heard of microgrids. So microgrids are generally mid-sized facilities that may be used by anywhere between 2 and 50 or maybe 100 people, neighbors sharing energy across property lines and using one generating facility to meet their needs. A microgrid also allows the capture of waste heat because the waste heat can be used locally. So mid-sized facilities are actually more efficient than large-scale facilities and even individual facilities because you don't have the big transmission lines of the large-scale facilities, and you can also capture the waste heat, which is something you can't do in large-scale facilities. And then you have the economies of scale and purchase power and informational power that you don't have when it's just an individual developing. But back to my point, which is that few levels of government have really said anything about microgrids, and I think more should take a position on those. So the regulatory overlap, lack of consistent rules, failure to account for all possible project configurations, these have all caused confusion for consumers, investors, utilities, and public entities. So contrary to other arguments, recent arguments in the legal literature, the paper that I'll write as a result of this talk will contend that state legislatures, not Congress, and not local political bodies should assert themselves as the primary regulators of small-scale and mid-sized onshore renewable energy facilities. In my mind, the quest to expand the renewable energy sector meets the criteria set forth by Bosselman and Callies in the Quiet Revolution and therefore merits state influence. So just briefly, let me discuss why states are particularly capable of handling this issue. For one thing, states are better than localities, or sorry, in general, states are better than localities at dealing with siting because they are neutral, because they are competent in these areas, and because they've had other experiences in renewable energy issues that make them, that would allow for some programmatic consistency. So on the neutrality point, states have the ability, at least in theory, to be arbiters of disputes between two localities. So when one locality doesn't want to accept a renewable energy project, or another locality objects to one locality's acceptance of a renewable energy project, the state may be able to to weigh in. States also have the substantive competency to analyze siting questions, since they routinely deal with transmission lines and other related physical issues. Finally, states have been leaders in supporting renewable energy initiatives. So they've pioneered the development of renewable portfolio standards, basically requirements or objectives that they want to meet in terms of their own energy consumption. They've provided incentives for qualifying projects, and this is everything from property tax incentives to sales tax relief to the PACE programs that you may have heard about. And states have also supported political institutions, everything from legislative committees on energy and environmental issues to public utility commissions with special expertise in energy issues. So in making this argument that states should really become the primary regulators of siting, I don't think we need new state-level institutions. At the heart of the quiet revolution is the preservation of local autonomy. So therefore, working to supplement existing zoning and planning rules, states should clarify how local governments should treat renewable energy siting. So in my handout, I list 5 different ways that this may happen, and I just wanted to go through them briefly, and I'll add a 6th in this presentation. So the first one is to provide a list of priorities or factors for consideration during local decision-making or local code development. And for these, it would be, because we need renewable energy, it would be great to include renewable energy toward the top. A second idea would be to provide guidelines for how facilities should be sited, facilities to be sited either across 2 localities, across local jurisdiction lines, maybe some of these mid-sized neighbor-neighbor sharing relationships, guidelines as to how they should be sited. A third is to provide limitations on local boards' ability to deny siting applications for renewable energy projects. And this is something that Chris mentioned, and it's also something that I wrote about in an article in 2008 about green building and the quiet revolution and green building control. So this, Connecticut, the state that I teach in, has done this, as Chris's PowerPoint mentioned, as well as some other states. So just to tell localities, there's only so much you can do to restrict certain renewable energy technology projects. Fourth, the state could provide rules to fast-track permits and to have special building codes that are applicable to renewable energy technologies. Fifth, and this is related to the 6th, I'll actually say the 6th one first, which is clarification that microgrids, which are really the best renewable energy solution when economical and efficient land use is concerned, provide the clarification that microgrids are authorized and to tell localities how they should site microgrids. And then related to that, the 5th item in your packet, which is provide authority for the creation of block-level energy districts. So provide a way to actually incentivize these microgrids by providing a financing mechanism for them so that neighbors can get together and administer and, again, finance projects through micro-institutions that I call block-level energy districts. And I've written about that in a prior paper as well. But again, focusing here on just the renewable energy siting question, I actually am just going to close with a one-sentence summary of my argument, which is that wherever the federal government has not preempted state and local control, and that, again, particularly with respect to small-scale individual or mid-sized microgrid type facilities, states should take up the quiet revolution and play a greater role in siting regulation, in providing guidance to localities, and encouraging both the small-scale and mid-sized renewable energy projects that we need to meet our ever-growing energy demands. And I'll stop there. Thanks a lot.
Well, that was very concise and very, very timely. Dave and I would like to thank Celeste Hammond and the Center for Real Estate Law for putting this program together. I've been to a number of Celeste's programs. She's been doing programs with the Center of Real Estate Law here for now 10 years, is it? It's a really valuable institution for the bar in the city of Chicago. I think that this law school and the Center for Real Estate Law have really filled a niche that nobody else has tried to fill in this city, and I think she's done an excellent job. And I'm glad that she put this topic on her list, because it required me to go back and ask myself, well, why did they want us to write this report anyway? And to be honest, it took me a while to remember, and I had to go back, and in the course of the last couple of months or so, I sort of relived President Nixon's first term. And it's uncanny. The amount of federal legislation that was passed with the approval of President Nixon that enlarged the federal power over all sorts of environmental issues, civil rights issues, and a number of these have been mentioned in earlier presentations. This was a Republican president, and it's a little hard to make that connection with the positions that the Republican Party are taking today, but it's true. The fact is that we wrote this report because President Nixon told John Ehrlichman that Senator Jackson had proposed a National Land Use Policy Act, and I want to propose my own National Land Use Policy Act. And John Ehrlichman, who was his domestic policy advisor and was a land use attorney from Seattle, got Russell Train and Bill Riley and Boyd Gibbons, people at the CEQ, together and said, okay, write us an act. And they said, well, the first thing we ought to do is figure out what is going on in the various states. And so they asked us to prepare this report. When the National Land Use Policy Act passed the Senate, Nixon did write his version of the act. It was blended in with Jackson's version. Passed the Senate. It was considered in Congress in 70, 71, 72, 73. They really thought it was going to pass. The magical year, as Ed Sullivan referred to it, and as Susan and Steve recalled, lots of things were very optimistic in 1973. It didn't pass. It failed in the House by 7 votes in 1974. Why? And as far as I know, nobody has proposed a National Land Use Policy Act in this country since then, nor do I think they ever will. Well, why was 73 the magical year? Well, in October of 1973, the Arab nations, in response to our support of Israel in a war in the Middle East, blockaded or refused to sell oil to the United States and other countries that had supported Israel. The cost of gasoline went up, trebled. The economy took a terrible hit, and development, particularly development of housing, home building, tanked. People were beginning to then reconsider, where should we be building? If gasoline, well, of course the price if I told you what the price of gasoline had gone up to, you would think, people are complaining, yeah. But they were complaining because it was 3 times what they'd been used to paying. And so as I got to thinking about this, okay, well, that was what we in the energy law game call the first oil shock. And another one came along in 1979 when Iran was taken over and the price tripled again. And so we had foreign governments, in effect, telling us they've adopted policies that affect us in terms of our land use decisions. Now, Celeste said at the outset that I was going to advocate the globalization of land use control. That, of course, was what kept you here, right? To the very end, ready with your tar and feathers to throw. I'm not advocating the globalization of land use control. I'm telling you that the globalization of land use control has taken place. And if you think about it, you'll agree, I believe. What other examples are there? Saudi Arabia is the only nation that can set oil prices. Saudi Arabia is the only nation that has any excess capacity to produce oil in the short term. It is Saudi Arabia that has priced oil and gasoline in this country. If in 1985, when Saudi Arabia decided the price got too high, they just pumped more oil. Price of gasoline went down. Our economy improved tremendously, and building development improved again. But think of today. Look at China. I mean, what impact has China had on our land use policy by keeping their currency rates fixed as they are now? Do we have any kind of manufacturing of the kinds of products that we now go to Walmart and see are made in China? Products that were at one time made here? No. And if you want to build a plant to put it, well, I just bought a new computer, IBM computer, made in China, right? IBM, big dominant company. So there's a Chinese policy that is affecting our land use decisions because nobody's going to build that kind of facility in this country anymore. Japan, when the oil prices went up, many of you are too young to remember this, but Japan adopted an industrial policy that said we were going to make small cars and sell them in the United States. And that was not just the happenstance of individual car manufacturers. That was a Japanese agency, MITI, enforcing a industrial policy on all of the Japanese automakers that they had to comply with, and did so very successfully, and as you know the result. Even little countries, Bolivia. You know how Bolivia is affecting our land use policy? They control, well, we won't get into the cocaine issue, but they control lithium. And by increasing the price and reducing the production of lithium, they can make it impossible for us to build certain types of equipment that are dependent on lithium. The Chinese, of course, are doing the same thing with these rare earths. They've now imposed a moratorium on any further production of rare earths in China in order, they say, to protect the environment of China. But you know, maybe that's their motivation, and maybe they're just trying to control the market. India, these outsourcing facilities that have moved to India, all these call centers and all of the law research operations that have moved to India. It's not just because the private sector has chosen to do that. India has had a policy of subsidizing the training of people to operate this kind of facility. So I'm not saying that any of these things are necessarily wrong or that I'm advocating them. All I'm saying is they're happening. We no longer, in 1971, we still had the perception that the United States, the great superpower, could make its own decisions at the national level, and that would be that. We don't have that perception anymore. We have to respond to the policies of other countries or not respond to them. But if we don't respond to them, those policies affect us. Not because we want them to or that we're advocating that they do, but it's a globalized world. And the idea that we could have a national land use policy, I think, is obsolete. Well, I could give you a lot more examples of that. But let me just close by saying that when I got to thinking about what was the real impact of that report, I think it was illustrated by many of the speakers here today. The real impact of that report was people in all sorts of occupations and industries and interest groups looked at that and they said, this light bulb went off. And they said, you mean you couldn't go to the state legislature or the federal government and get an override of local zoning? And that was always there. I mean, and I think people would have figured it out on their own. But as was who was it that talked about? I'm sorry, the legislatures began to get involved, and people in everything from group homes to gravel pits said, well, we'll get our own law that says we're going to override the local government one way or another in various ways. And I thought about trying to collect all the examples of these very narrowly focused statutes that have been passed, but it's hopeless. But they are not, for the most part, involved in any sort of comprehensive planning. The decision to site solar panels will be made by some agency that's expert in the knowledge of where solar panels can best be located, but not necessarily acquainted with any sort of overall planning principle. Now there are exceptions, and in Oregon and others that have been discussed in the Adirondacks. And, there are local governments that are trying to do a good job despite these various lobbies. But I'm afraid that I have to take a fairly narrow perspective about the future. I think that what we did is open Pandora's box, and not only the state legislatures, but as Patty indicated, the Congress now responds to all sorts of interest groups. Some of them you can agree with, and some you don't agree with, but they are completely separate and unrelated laws that completely that do not recognize the existence of all these other laws. So that's my closing comment. Depressing as it may sound, I think that that we did a good job in writing this report, and we'll see what the future will bring. I would like to get the other members of this last panel back up here now, and so we can respond to your questions. I don't think I'll ask you to write them down, though if anybody has written one down and wants to read it or bring it up, be happy to do that.
Fred, I have a
Susan.
question for you. When you say that the notion we could have a national land use policy is obsolete, do you mean to say completely obsolete? That is to say, and let me put words in your mouth, notwithstanding the fact that global forces beyond our control have impact for our land use policies, do you believe the federal government has a role to play in land use regulation?
Well, I think as Patricia said, I mean, it is playing a role. Will it ever do it in some sort of comprehensive way? And I think she's absolutely right. No, it won't. The world's too complicated.
But is that a reason, for example, for the federal government not to have a fair housing policy and something, or a clean air policy?
No, I'm sure that the federal government will continue to have a policy. Would I like it better if it were somehow integrated into more of an overall plan? Yeah, but I'm not suggesting that if we don't do anything, we're going to be all controlled by foreign government policy.
So California recently tried, continues to try to reorganize itself around the issue of climate and greenhouse gas, and has directed all state agencies as well as local agencies to adopt climate action plans and to develop regional plans based on those climate action plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, based in large part on changes in land use patterns and transportation patterns. The result has been special purpose agencies across the board saying sea level rise is going to go up by 5 feet, so don't build here, when transit agencies are saying build exactly where that inundation zone exists because that's where our transit corridors are, where water agencies are saying, by the way, do infiltration so we have more drinking water, and the planning agencies are saying, but make sure you fully densify with as much coverage as you can, so that we have density in development patterns. In other words, all the special purpose agencies are doing exactly what their special purpose is around a common theme of climate with no referee. You guys have been at this so long. It's been so inspiring to hear you. It's so nice to not be in California for a day and see our partner. Do you have any suggestions for how we might get ourselves out of this mess that we've created? Been there, done that.
Well, I think part of it is getting the stakeholders represented by the professional interests who are developing these plans together in a room so that they can speak to each other and further the understanding of what each other is doing and why they're doing it, and see if they can work it out through some sort of cooperation or civil discourse among these agencies, because I do think that people don't understand if it's not in their silo. That they know what they have to do that is the ideal for what they've been trained in and what they do, and they don't understand they don't know what they don't know from the other disciplines. And so I think that in the area of climate change and sustainability in general, it is cross-disciplinary if we're going to do it right.
I think Patricia's right. We had a situation in Salt Lake City when we wrote a water conserving landscape.
Can you hear back there? These mics, turn
Is that on? Is it on? We had a situation in Salt Lake City when the mayor wanted to write a water conserving landscape ordinance to protect rivers and reduce energy use. And our biggest battle was with the water utility, which was also reported to him. But we did just like Patty said, and it was not easy. It took us a year. They wanted to sell more water because that's their job, is to sell more water. But in the end, they came around. But it was a tough process, that arm wrestling, and I think you're right. That's going to happen. I was with Peter Calthorpe about a year ago. He was much more optimistic about what was going to happen in California. So I guess we'll see.
He's a neighbor and a friend, and he's a little bit discouraged.
Well, there are some good things going on that don't necessarily require a broad-based comprehensive planning and integrated effort. And you mentioned California, San Jose, California. There's a project to heat 10,000 gallons a day to serve 320 residential units, which will take a lot of stress off the grid. And half of the states in the last 3 years have enacted, and Sarah probably knows more about this than I certainly do, have enacted legislation which is essentially tax increment financing for the retrofitting of sustainable energy sources. And I guess what I was trying to say is that we got to play with the cards we're dealt. We got 300,000 of these homeowners associations. We know that we got to have more sustainable energy. We know that we're probably not going to have broad-based, comprehensive federal or even state level planning. But we can do a lot with what we've got. And these programs, this development, Sonoma Mountain Village, 200-acre mixed-use development, just got $1.6 million, sufficient to do a 1 megawatt solar system, which will be paid back in tax revenues in a 5 to 20 year period. So you've seen some of these, right? These types of programs? Go past that.
I mean, I have little, can you hear me? I have little to add. It seems like there are a lot of questions, but I agree with you that that's going to be one of the ways to encourage private investors to come together, and also to encourage some of these agencies that are working right now at cross purposes to move forward.
Yvette?
Yeah, this has been really wonderful, and I really enjoy the historic. However, our orientation has traditionally in this room been public policy and social policy and government policy. I'm interested in what you all think about economic policy and how, whether the economic conditions we live in impacts the planning process for the big picture. I hear from the gentleman who spoke about private associations, of which I am 1 in 5 who live in such, that the tendency is to contract in bad economic times because it perceives that the value of your property will be protected. So I am very interested in what you think about the relationship between the economic situation and the positive planning process.
Well, that was my hastily done addendum on the economic situation. I believe that the quiet revolution is fueled in large part by development pressure. We are going to have, I was just at a meeting of the people that seem to know what they're talking about, including Tony Downs and others, and they are convinced that we're going to have a corrugated bottom recovery. We're just going to bounce along for a very long time. And the development's going to occur in the high population growth centers, Austin, Dallas, San Francisco. Twitter just leased a whole lot of space with an incentive by the city of San Francisco. They're not going to be driven by speculative value increases, but they're going to be driven by real estate deals that yield value today. So I think that the quiet revolution is chilled enormously by our recession. there's things that we can do and still will do, but it's a process that I believe is greatly slowed by the lack of a development economy.
I would agree with that, I guess, with traditional building, but I think you're seeing something opposite on the green building side. I mean, you actually are seeing those forms of development, green building and with sustainable features actually coming to the fore because they're making money. Exactly. They're making money. They actually will save money in the long run and they can make money off those developments. They're sort of a niche now. And so it's interesting to see what's happening. You know, all bets are off. If people finally do agree that climate is changing, 47% of the people in the U.S. don't believe there's any climate change. If the data continue to mount, there's going to be some strong reasoning. I mean, it's very interesting to be in Miami, which has not really been, I guess, a hotbed of good land use management. At least some people would say. The thought that 50% or 25% of that city may be underwater in 50 years, it's sobering people up. And so that's a different driver, that the whole scientific basis of climate change and what it means in terms of sea level rise, floods, violent storms, drought. That could change things in my mind pretty quickly.
And just to add, if you could. Just to add that, in other areas, we've seen that in times of economic recession, depression, we started to think more big picture about policy issues. And so the Quiet Revolution, it's about what level of government is best suited to solve problems. And we may start thinking about these things when, when planners may not be doing as much work on the day-to-day to rush through to get development projects done. So I'm optimistic. I think maybe we'll think about these issues a little more. And just to point out, in the in historic preservation context, a lot of our greatest and best preserved and now the highest property value neighborhoods were preserved because they were not being developed, right? Because they were passed over for development. So I think there's some opportunities. We may not feel like there are opportunities right now, but I think there's some opportunities in the long run that may arise from this recession.
Other questions?
Will you respond to it?
Oh, you wanted me to respond to that? Okay. Well, of course, I've lived through quite a few economic cycles that have affected real estate. I'm not surprised that there's one going on. I'm not going to try to predict how long it'll last or whether it's corrugated or whatever, because predictions have always been very difficult in this area. But we've lived through any number of such cycles, and I hope we'll live through this one. The point I was going to make, though, is that it's not something we can really control. You say, what can we do something about the economy? Can we do something about the economy? I don't know that we can. I mean, right now, I looked at the news today, but has Greece stopped using the euro? I mean, our stock market has been going up and down about the question of whether the countries in Europe are going to be stable in terms of their currency. China is continuing to produce goods at much lower prices than we can produce. We don't have that much control over our economy. I don't think that. I don't know what I would do if I were the president. I don't think any of the. I don't think the president knows what to do, and I don't think any of the Republican candidates know what to do about the economy.
I just want to take a more narrow view because I'm sort of looking at things through the local government perspective. In tough economic times, some of the things that I think local governments can do quicker than state or federal government in the area of planning and zoning. We have the aging of the baby boomers. We have to deal with affordable housing. Every baby boomer is not moving into a high-end, active senior living community. And people, maybe, not all of them, house rich and cash poor. People lost a lot of money in investments. People need to have housing options. We need to take care of that at the local level. We need to look at accessory dwelling units. We need to look at a whole host of tools that we know are in the toolbox. Washington's not going to do that for the communities, and the state government is not going to do that. People lost, many people, hundreds of thousands of people lost jobs in this economy. Well, unemployment benefits are running out. People are looking for other options. There aren't enough jobs out there. If people are coming back from the war, there aren't jobs for folks. Well, what can we do at the local government level? We can relook at our zoning codes and look at what we do to encourage small-scale startup businesses, how we deal with regulating home occupations, things that we can put in our comprehensive plans to say, we acknowledge these impacts of the economy, and what is it that we can do? I don't think, again, the state governments or Washington can do it for us. What they can do for local governments in a cooperative sense is provide some money to update those plans and to make sure that they get implemented. So I see in tough economic times, where the rubber hits the road, it's self-help at the local level.
You know, I hope I didn't give, I think maybe I've given the wrong impression in what I said. I'm not opposed to what Patty says by any means, or what Sarah is suggesting. I mean, I think there are lots of things that local governments can do. I think there's lots of things that the private sector can do, even in tough economic times. But the idea behind the Quiet Revolution was that there would be a national land use policy, and that national land use policy would be delegating power to the state and federal government, and that they would do a better job of controlling land use. And what I'm saying is, I don't think they would because of globalization, because so much of our land use decision making is now controlled by other governments that there's no point anymore in considering, certainly not a national land use policy. I don't know to what extent individual states, even California, which is a foreign power in many ways. Well, if you look at the other Western states, they're viewed as a foreign power because they control what kind of electricity you can build in Wyoming, because the place to sell it is in California, and then they'll only take a certain type of renewable electricity and so on. I think we have reached the allocated time, and I want Celeste to take note of the fact that I have done that. And Celeste, do you want to make some?
I don't have much to say. I think this was a wonderful discussion and discourse, and I think we're all in it together, and did a superb job from our sponsors to our speakers to the audience, and I think we should all take a lot of praise for that. Steve Elrod has some announcements for those of you only those of you who have already registered for the reception. So I'll hand it over to Steve, but thank you to the third panel.